By spring, Cedar Hollow had already decided who Amelia Reeves would marry. The whole town had. Everyone but the man who spent his nights quietly paying off a debt that wasn't his to carry. And the night fire took the north end of Main Street. He walked into it not for the building, but for the woman whose name was written in a ledger only he had ever seen. Wyoming Territory, 10889. In Cedar Hollow, the Cowboys were the heroes. Everyone agreed on this the same way everyone agreed which direction the wind came from in March, or which creek ran dry first in August. It was not a matter of debate. It was simply how the town had always sorted itself: cowboys at the top of the ledger and everyone else filling in beneath them. They rode in from the Bar K and the Diamond T with dust on their hats and easy laughter in their throats. And Cedar Hollow received them the way it received anything new and shining, with open arms and short memory. Micah Sutton made horseshoes. He was 26 years old, built wide through the shoulders from 10 years at an anvil that had belonged to his father before it belonged to him. He had inherited it early, not by choice, but the way a man inherits weather arriving, whether he was ready or not. His older brother Daniel had run Sutton Forge until 2 years ago, when a coupling failed at the rail yard and pinned him beneath 1,100 pounds of iron before anyone could reach him. Micah had been 18 feet away, working a different fitting. He had not seen it happen. He had only heard it, and then he had spent the rest of his life hearing it again on nights when the shop was too quiet. He inherited the forge. He also inherited the note on it, the loan Daniel had taken against new equipment the year before he died, unpaid and accruing at the Cedar Hollow Bank like a second shadow. Micah worked before sunrise and after dark to keep both of those things standing, the business and the debt attached to it. He did not talk about either. The town knew him the way it knew its own well, pump, necessary, unremarkable, taken for granted. He did not resent this. He built his life around it the way a man builds a fence around a field he intends to keep working, whether anyone watches him do it or not. What he had told no one was that he had noticed Amelia Reeves the morning she stepped off the train. I had been across the street from the depot, finishing a shoe on Otis Meacham's mare, one knee braced against the animal's flank. She came down the platform with a single trunk and a posture that dared the town to find fault with her, the way a person carries themselves when they've already survived the worst anyone can say. She looked at Cedar Hollow the way you'd look over a horse you were thinking of buying, checking its legs, its teeth, its temperament, searching for the flaw that would tell her whether to trust the place. Then she looked across the street and found him instead. He held her eyes for exactly as long as it took to realize he was still holding them. Then he looked back down at the mare's hoof and finished the nail. He told himself this meant nothing. He told himself this for the rest of the afternoon, hammering rhythm into iron until his arm ached, and it was not until he blew out the forge lamp that night that he admitted to himself he had thought about almost nothing else since noon. The ledger was waiting for him on the wall by the door, the way it waited every night. He opened it out of habit, more than need. He knew the number without looking, and ran his thumb down the column of Daniel's handwriting, turning into his own. $210 remained on the equipment note, due in full by the first thaw, an amount that had felt manageable in autumn, and felt considerably less manageable now that November was closing in cold. I was not a man who allowed himself much room for wanting things. The forge did not leave space for it, and the debt left even less. But he found blowing out the lamp that he was already turning over an excuse to be standing across the street again the next time the morning train came through, and he was honest enough with himself in the dark to admit that the excuse had nothing to do with horseshoes. Word moved through Cedar Hollow fast, the way it always did. By supper, the whole town knew the new woman had taken the empty storefront. Next to the milliner's, that her name was Amelia Reeves, that she'd come from Independence, Missouri, and that she intended to open a dress shop before the month was out. Odessa Vance, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the keeper of every fact worth knowing, had already decided Amelia was a fine addition to Cedar Hollow, and said so to anyone who would listen. Micah heard the news, the way he heard most things, second-hand over the sound of his own hammer from a customer more interested in gossip than in the state of his plow blade. He said nothing in response. He filed the information the way he filed everything that mattered to him, and no one else, quietly and without comment. That night, he added a line to the bottom of the ledger, not about money, just a date, September the 14th. He did not examine why he'd written it, only that some part of him wanted the day marked down somewhere, the same careful way he marked down every debt he intended eventually to settle. Amelia Reeves had learned somewhere between the wreck of her father's business and the wreck of her engagement that a woman survives on exactly two things: skill and the refusal to explain herself to people who haven't earned it. She opened Reeves Dress Works on the 1st of October with a rented storefront, a bolt of good gingham she couldn't yet afford, and a note at the Cedar Hollow Bank secured against what remained of her father's land in Missouri, sold at a loss the previous spring. She had come west with one trunk, one set of shears, and a conviction that whatever Wyoming territory turned out to be, it would at least be a place where no one had watched her fall. Her father's freight company had failed in the spring of 1887, undone by a bad contract and a worse partner. And it had taken 18 months for the full weight of that failure to reach the people who mattered to her. Her fiancé, Robert Ashford, had been among the last things it touched. He had not been cruel about it. He had simply stopped calling, and then he had married a banker's daughter from St. Louis by Christmas, and Amelia had understood, with a clarity that still ached, that he had never wanted her only what she had been worth when he met her. She did not intend to be worth anything to anyone again in quite that way. She intended to build something that was entirely hers, paid for with her own hands, owing nothing to a man's good opinion of her prospects. The shears had been her father's, a fine pair of Sheffield steel, with his initials worked into the handle, and she kept them on the counter where customers could see them, not for sentiment. Exactly, though there was some of that too, but because a woman running a business alone in a cattle town did well to remind people that she came from somewhere, that she had not simply appeared out of nowhere with nothing behind her. The note at the bank sat at $230, due by the spring thaw, an amount she intended to have paid down considerably before Cedar Hollow's short, hard winter was finished. She had built a business before, watched her father build one and lose it, and she understood the arithmetic of survival better than most 27-year-old women had any reason to. She kept careful books. She turned no customer away for lack of ready cash if she trusted they'd settle eventually. She worked by lamplight most evenings until her eyes ached. It was on one of those evenings closing the shop at dusk that she first noticed the sound. The forge sat 2 doors down and across the street, and its rhythm, the ring of hammer on iron, steady as a heartbeat, had become part of the town's evening noise without her particularly marking when that had happened. She noticed it now because she found herself standing at her own window longer than the view required, watching orange light spill from the forge doors into the darkening street. She told herself this was simple curiosity, the kind any newcomer felt toward the workings of an unfamiliar town. She told herself the same thing 3 days later when she chose the longer route to the dry goods store, the one that passed directly in front of Sutton Forge instead of behind the church, and she told herself it again the week after that, until the telling wore thin enough that she stopped bothering. She had seen the blacksmith exactly once up close in the 6 weeks since she'd arrived, a brief exchange at the general store where he'd held the door for her and said nothing beyond a nod, his hands scarred and ink-black at the knuckles in a way that spoke of a decade's honest work. She had not thought much of it at the time. She thought of it more now than she cared to admit, turning the memory over some evenings, the way she turned over a hem to check the stitching, looking for what exactly had caught in it. Odessa Vance, delivering a length of ribbon trim order to the shop in late October, mentioned him without prompting, the way Odessa mentioned everyone eventually. "Sutton keeps to himself," she said, folding her hands over her apron. "Lost his brother 2 years back at the rail yard. Runs that forge alone, now works himself half to death if you ask me. Good man though. Fixed my porch step free of charge last spring and wouldn't hear a word about payment." Amelia said nothing to this beyond a polite sound of interest and busied herself with the ribbon. But that night, closing the ledger on a slow day's takings, she found she was thinking less about her own account and more about a man who fixed things for free and said nothing about it afterward. And she understood, with the same clear-eyed honesty she applied to everything else in her life, that she had just found a reason to need something mended. She chose the display case latch because it was in fact broken, a small mercy that meant she wasn't lying outright, only arranging the truth to suit her purposes. The latch had been loose since she'd bought the case second-hand from the outgoing dry goods clerk, and she told herself, carrying it across the street on a Thursday afternoon in late October, that any sensible businesswoman would have had it fixed weeks ago. The forge hit her, the way it always hit newcomers, heat first, then noise, then the smell of coal and hot iron that seemed to work its way into cloth and stay there. Micah was at the anvil, shaping a length of stock into a hinge with the unhurried economy of a man who had done the same motion 10,000 times before. He finished his stroke before he looked up. "Miss Reeves," he said. He knew her name. She hadn't expected that, though she supposed she should have. Cedar Hollow was not a place where a new resident stayed anonymous past the first week. She held out the latch. He took it and turned it over in his hands, and she watched him examine it with more attention than a broken latch reasonably deserved, running his thumb along the hinge pin, testing the give of the metal. "It's not the latch," he said finally. "It's the plate underneath. Someone mounted it a hair off true, and it's been working the screws loose ever since. Fix the latch without fixing the plate, and you'll be back here inside a month." Nobody had mentioned the plate. She hadn't looked that closely herself. He said it the way he seemed to say everything without judgment, simply stating what was true because stating it was useful. "How long will it take?" she asked. "Come back Thursday." She came back Thursday. The latch was fixed, the plate reset, and a small crack in the case's corner joint, one she hadn't noticed, one that would have widened with the winter cold, filled and sanded smooth without a word of explanation until she asked, "You fixed the corner too?" "It was there," he said. "Would have split clean through by January." She paid him less than she'd expected, and more than he'd asked for, which he accepted without comment, and she left with the distinct sense that she had learned something about him that had nothing to do with metalwork. She came back the following Tuesday with a genuinely broken hinge from her workroom door, the Tuesday after that with a window latch that had admittedly taken very little encouragement to become broken in the first place. By the third Tuesday, she had run out of items in her shop with any legitimate claim to disrepair. And she arrived instead with 2 cups of coffee from Odessa's kitchen and the frank admission that she'd come to watch him work if he didn't mind the company. Micah Sutton, who had never once in 10 years been watched at his work by anyone who wasn't paying him to do it, considered this for a moment longer than the question probably warranted. "Suit yourself," he said, and set out a second stool without being asked. She sat and watched him shape a length of iron into a wagon, fitting the fire, throwing shifting light across the walls, and found that the silence between them asked nothing of her. It was not the strained silence of 2 strangers searching for conversation. It was closer to the quiet of a room where the work itself did most of the talking, and she was content for the better part of an hour simply to listen to the rhythm of hammer on anvil and let her own thoughts settle around it. "You don't talk much," she observed eventually, not as a complaint. "Not much worth saying most days," he said without looking up. "Iron doesn't care what you tell it, only what you do to it." She turned this over for a long moment. "That's not entirely true of people either," she said, "though most of us pretend otherwise." He glanced up at that just once, just long enough for her to see something flicker behind the careful neutrality he wore the way other men wore their hats. And then he went back to the iron, and she went back to her coffee, and neither of them said anything else that afternoon that mattered half as much as what had passed unspoken between the two sentences. She walked home in the last of the daylight, thinking not for the first time that she had come to Cedar Hollow to open a dress shop and seemed instead to be building something else entirely, one invented excuse at a time. Nathaniel Colby rode into Cedar Hollow in the first week of November with the kind of confidence that comes from a life spent being told consistently and by people who mattered that he was exactly the kind of man a town ought to want. He was 25 foreman of the Barkay's entire outfit, trusted with more cattle and more men than most ranchers twice his age, and he wore that trust the way he wore his good hat, easily and without much thought to how he'd earned it. I was not by any honest measure a difficult man to like. He was quick with a joke, quicker with a compliment, and genuinely uncomplicatedly kind in the way of a man who had rarely needed to be anything else. When he decided within his first week in town that Amelia Reeves was worth courting properly, he did it the way he did everything, directly and with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to things working out in his favor. He appeared at Reeves' Dress Works on a Wednesday afternoon with a bouquet ordered special from a florist in Cheyenne, delivered by the same rail line that had killed Daniel Sutton, though Nate had no reason to know that, and Amelia did not mention it. "Miss Reeves," he said, removing his hat with a small flourish that somehow avoided seeming showy. "I understand you're new to town, and it struck me a new arrival oughtn't spend her evenings friendless." She accepted the flowers with genuine warmth and the specific private calculation of a woman who understood exactly what an ordered bouquet signaled and was already measuring how to respond without cruelty. He was, she noted, entirely sincere. That was precisely the difficulty. Odessa Vance heard about the flowers before the bouquet had finished wilting. "Nathaniel Colby," she said, delivering the name to Amelia across the dry goods counter like a verdict already returned. "Good family back in Missouri, if I recall right. Small world, that. Steady work, the bar. Kay trusts him with everything. Half the young women in this county have set their cap for him, and not one has managed to catch it. He's very kind," Amelia said, which was true, and which she recognized even as she said it as the sort of thing a person says about a man she has already decided not to marry. Odessa looked at her the way she looked at ledgers that failed to balance. "But, no but," Amelia said pleasantly, and paid for her thread. On her way out, she glanced across the street toward the forge, toward the steady ring of hammer on iron that she now heard so often. She could tell without looking whether Micah was shaping something delicate or something heavy, and she caught herself, not for the first time, comparing the two men in a way that felt faintly unfair to both of them. Nate called on her again the following week, and the week after that, always pleasant, always attentive, never overstepping. He walked her home from church twice, told stories that made the whole congregation laugh over Sunday dinner, remembered small details about her, that she preferred her coffee black, that she'd mentioned missing the sound of a piano, and brought them up again with the flattering care of a man genuinely trying to know her. She danced with him at a barn raising in mid-November, and found the dancing itself perfectly pleasant, his hand steady at her waist, his conversation easy and undemanding. She waited through the whole of it for some spark of the feeling she'd had crossing a dusty street in September and catching a blacksmith's eye for exactly 1 second too long. It did not come. She danced 2 full songs with Nathaniel. Colby laughed at his stories, thanked him warmly when the music ended, and felt walking home afterward, in the cold, considerably more unsettled than a pleasant evening, with a perfectly good man had any right to leave her. She stopped at the edge of Main Street, where the light still spilled from the forge. Though it was well past an hour, any reasonable customer would call, and stood for a moment simply listening to the sound of Micah working alone. She did not go in. She told herself it was too late for an unannounced visit, and that was true enough as far as it went. But standing there in the cold, with Nate's kindness still fresh in her memory, and doing nothing at all for the ache under her ribs, she understood something about herself that she was not yet ready to say out loud, even to Odessa, even to the shears on her counter, that had heard every other confession she'd made since arriving in Cedar Hollow. She understood that the town had already decided who she belonged with, and that the town, for the first time in her life, was very likely about to be wrong. The trouble found her on a Tuesday in the second week of November, in the unglamorous form of a fabric order she could not cover. A rancher's wife out past the diamond. T wanted 6 new shirts and 2 dresses before Christmas payment on delivery, and filling an order that size meant buying more wool and cotton than Amelia currently had cash to purchase. She did the math twice at her workbench, the way she'd learned to do math from her father, before he'd stopped being someone whose numbers could be trusted, and both times it came out short. She went to the Cedar Hollow Bank the following morning to ask about extending credit against the order itself, and left 40 minutes later with considerably more information than she'd gone in for. The note officer, a precise, unhurried man named Wilkes, informed her that her existing note, the $230 secured against her shop, needed to be current principal and interest, both by the first thaw, no later, or the bank would be obligated to call the debt in full. He said this without unkindness, in the flat procedural tone of a man reciting a fact he'd recited to 100 people before her. She had known the deadline existed. She had not let herself calculate until sitting across the desk from Wilkes exactly how tight the arithmetic of the next 4 months would need to be to meet it. The fear that rose in her was an old familiar one, and that was the worst part of it, not the fear itself, but recognizing it, the exact shape of the dread that had settled over her family's dinner table in the last months before her father's company failed. She had told herself coming west that she'd left that fear in Missouri along with everything else. She understood now, walking out of the bank into the cold, that fear did not stay where you left it. It simply waited for the next ledger to attach itself to. She did not go to the forge that afternoon. She went home and worked until her fingers ached and did not let herself think past the next stitch. Micah, as it happened, was at the bank that same afternoon, delivering a set of iron brackets Wilkes had commissioned for the new vault door, and it was there, setting the brackets on the counter, that he saw her name. The ledger lay open where the clerk had left it, an oversight more than a lapse, and Micah's eye caught the columned entry, the way a craftsman's eye catches an uneven weld automatically, without meaning to look for it. Reeves. A. $230 first thaw. He read it in the 2 seconds before the clerk noticed the ledger was exposed and closed it, and he did not mention that he'd seen it, not to the clerk, not to anyone. He carried the number back to the forge, the way he carried most things that mattered to him, silently and at some length. He knew exactly what a debt like that felt like, sitting over a person's shoulders through a hard winter. He knew better than most men in Cedar Hollow precisely how a number that size could keep a person working past the point their body wanted to stop. I was closing the forge that evening, well past dark, when Amelia passed on the boardwalk outside, walking faster and more purposefully than her usual pace, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She did not stop. She had not planned to stop, had told herself firmly on the walk over that she needed thread from the mercantile and nothing more. Though the mercantile had closed an hour earlier, and some part of her had known that when she set out. Micah in the doorway watched her pass, without quite deciding to watch her. Something in her face, a tightness around the eyes he hadn't seen there before, caught at him in a way the ledger entry alone had not. "Miss Reeves," he said. She stopped. "Mr. Sutton." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The forge light spilled between them onto the frozen street, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and went quiet. "Cold night for a walk," he said finally, which was not remotely what either of them was thinking. "It is," she agreed, and something in her voice, a thinness, a held-together quality, told him more than the ledger had. He did not ask her what was wrong. He was not a man who pried, and she was not, that night, a woman ready to be asked. But he stood in the doorway until she had turned the corner toward home, and when he went back inside to bank the forge fire for the night, he found himself doing the arithmetic of his own accounts, with a different number sitting alongside his own, and he did not examine yet exactly why. Micah made the decision, the way he made most decisions that mattered alone at the forge, turning it over until it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the only sensible course. The rail company paid well for coupling repair, better than any other work he could pick up in Cedar Hollow, and it was work he knew better than most men left standing. After Daniel died, having watched his brother do it 100 times before he ever touched a coupling himself. It was also, without question, the most dangerous work available to him, close, unshielded fitting on live equipment, the exact kind of task that had put 1,100 pounds of iron on top of his brother 2 years before. He took the contract anyway. He told himself the money would clear Amelia's note faster than any other work available to him, and it would, and he told himself this was simply the practical solution to a problem. He happened to know about nothing more complicated than that. He did not examine closely why a debt that wasn't his had become the thing he was willing to risk his hands and possibly his life to solve. He started the following Monday, working the forge through the ordinary daylight hours and the rail yard from 10 at night until his arms gave out, sometimes past 2 in the morning. He told no one, not Odessa, who would have spread it through town by breakfast, and certainly not Amelia, who he suspected would refuse the money outright if she knew where it was going, and who he was not yet prepared to have that argument with. The work exhausted him in a way the forge alone never had. He came to the anvil each morning with his hands stiffer than they should have been at 26, his eyes shadowed, his patience worn thinner than he liked. When Amelia arrived Tuesday with her coffee and her lesson notes, he found himself short with her in a way that surprised them both. "Busy today," he said, not looking up from the wagon axle he was reshaping, and did not put out the second stool. She stood in the doorway a moment, coffee in hand, and something crossed her face that he did not let himself watch closely enough to name. "I can come back," she said. "Might be for the best," he said, the next while, and went back to the axle and did not see the way she set the second cup down on the workbench. Anyway, quietly, before she left, as though she meant for him to have it, even if he wouldn't let her stay to share it. This went on for the better part of 2 weeks. He grew leaner, quieter, more careful with his words in the particular way of a man conserving energy he can't afford to spend. The rail yard paid him Thursday by Thursday, and Thursday by Thursday, he carried the money to the Cedar Hollow Bank and asked Wilkes to apply it against the Reeves account, unsigned cash only, no name attached beyond the small initial the clerk noted out of habit and thought nothing of. Nate Colby, unaware of any of this, chose that same fortnight to formally invite Amelia to the Founders' Dance, the largest social event Cedar Hollow held all winter, and he did it with flowers again, and the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no by a woman he'd set his mind to. Amelia, who had spent 2 weeks watching Micah pull steadily further away from her without explanation, found she did not have a ready reason to refuse. She went to the forge that Tuesday evening later than her usual hour and found Micah banking the fire for the night. his hands wrapped in strips of cloth she hadn't seen the week before. "Why have you been so distant?" she said. It was not quite a question. She had decided walking over that she was owed a direct answer. He did not turn around right away. When he did, his voice was even careful, the same tone he used for pricing a job he didn't especially want. "You should go to the dance with Nate," he said. "He's a good man, steady. He can give you things I can't." "That isn't what I asked you. It's the answer that matters," he said, and picked the tongs back up, and she watched his hands wrapped unsteady in a way his voice was not, and understood with a clarity that made the walk home feel very long and very cold. That she had heard this exact contradiction from him once before in smaller pieces, and had let it pass without naming it. She did not let it pass this time, not inside herself. She simply said nothing more because she had learned by now that Micah Sutton's hands told the truth long before his voice got around to it, and she intended to go to the dance and to watch very carefully what his hands did when he saw her there. The dance filled the Grange Hall past its comfortable capacity. Every lamp lit the fiddle player working through his second reel of the night by the time Amelia arrived on Nathaniel Colby's arm, in a dress of her own making, dark green wool, with a collar she'd cut and recut 3 times until it sat exactly right. Nate was as promised excellent company. He introduced her to ranchers and their wives she hadn't yet met, danced 2 reels with the easy competence of a man who'd learned young and never lost the habit, and told a story about a stampede on the Barkays Spring Drive that had the whole circle around them laughing before he'd finished the second sentence. He was by every visible measure exactly the evening a woman could have asked for. She was midway through the 3rd dance, Nate's hand steady at her waist, when she looked past his shoulder toward the edge of the hall and saw Micah standing near the door. She had not expected him. He never came to town socials. She'd been told this by 3 separate people since arriving, that the blacksmith kept to his own company and had no particular use for celebrating. But he was there in a clean she hadn't seen him wear before, his hands wrapped again beneath his cuffs. Watching her with an expression she recognized instantly, because she had seen its edges before in smaller doses at the forge, the look of a man watching something he had already decided he had no right to want. The music ended. Nate said something warm and easy that she barely heard. She smiled, thanked, and told him she needed a moment of air, and then she crossed the hall, not toward the door, but toward the man standing beside it. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. His voice did the careful, even thing it always did, but his hand holding his hat against his chest was gripping the brim hard enough to bend it. "Dance with me," she said. He looked at her and then passed her toward Nate, still visible across the room. "Miss Reeves." "Amelia," she said. "My name is Amelia, and I have been finding reasons to walk past your forge since October, and I am asking you to dance with me." I was quiet long enough that she thought for one unsteady moment that he might refuse her in front of the whole hall. Then he set his hat down on the bench beside them and held out his bandaged hand and led her onto the floor. I was not, by his own quiet admission, much of a dancer. He counted the steps under his breath low enough that only she could hear, and twice apologized for treading near her hem, and she found she did not mind any of it, found in fact that she preferred it considerably to Nate's easy competence, because every counted step told her something true about the man taking it. "You're doing fine," she said when he apologized a 3rd time. "I don't want to step on your feet," he said. And she laughed quietly and felt something in his shoulders ease slightly at the sound of it. They did not speak of the note, or the bank, or the 2 weeks he'd spent pulling away from her without explanation. There was not room for it in 3 minutes of fiddle music in a crowded hall, and both of them seemed by unspoken agreement to want this one dance kept simple. But when the music ended and he stepped back, his hand lingering a half-second longer than the dance required before he let hers go, she saw the whole room had noticed. Odessa Vance was watching from near the punch table, with an expression that suggested a fact was rearranging itself in her mind in real time. Nate across the hall was watching too, his face unreadable though not unkind. "Thank you," Micah said, and picked his hat back up, and the careful distance he'd kept for 2 weeks seemed for just a moment to have gone somewhere else entirely. "Micah," she said before he could retreat fully behind it again, "whatever you've decided about what you can and can't offer me, you should know I've stopped listening to it." He looked at her for a long moment, the hall noise rising up around them again, the fiddle starting a new reel. He did not answer her directly, but he did not walk away either, and when Nate crossed the room a few minutes later to reclaim her for the next dance, Amelia went with him easily enough because she had already gotten the answer she'd come looking for, not in words, but in the half-second his hand had refused to let go of hers. The whole town had seen it. By the time the dance ended, Cedar Hollow had a new piece of gossip to carry through its kitchens for the rest of the week. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Amelia found she did not mind at all what the town decided to say about her. She went to the bank the Monday after the dance to make her regular payment against the note coins counted out carefully from a good month's takings, and left 20 minutes later, having learned that her account required considerably less than she'd brought with her. "Someone's been paying it down," Wilkes told her, turning the ledger so she could see the entries herself. "Weekly near enough. Cash only, no name given beyond an initial. Started back in early November." He tapped the small, careful M inked beside 4 separate entries. "Left it that way on purpose, I'd guess. Didn't want it traced." Amelia stood at the counter for a long moment, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with dollars. She thought of Thursdays of the ironwork deliveries Wilkes received every Thursday afternoon for the vault door repairs of a man whose hands had been wrapped in fresh cloth for weeks longer than any single injury should have required, of 2 weeks of a blacksmith pulling away from her with a voice too careful and hands that never matched it. She thanked Wilkes, took her unnecessary coins back, and walked directly to the forge with a purpose that made 2 people on the boardwalk step aside to let her pass. Micah was at the anvil when she arrived, and something in her face must have told him what she'd come to say, because he set down his hammer before she'd said a word. "You've been paying my note," she said. It was not a question. "I don't know what you mean." "Micah, I don't know what you mean," he said again more firmly, and turned back to the iron, and she understood, watching him, that he intended to hold this particular lie for as long as she'd let him. "The clerk showed me the entries," she said. "An M every Thursday since the week after I saw you at the bank with those brackets. You saw my account that day. You've been working the rail yard at night. I've seen the hours in your hands for weeks and pretended not to notice because I didn't understand what I was looking at." He said nothing. His jaw was set in the particular way she'd come to recognize as a man holding a great deal very still. "Why," she said, "would you risk your hands, your life doing the exact work that killed your brother to pay a debt that isn't yours?" "Because I could," he said finally. And there was something raw underneath the careful evenness now, something that had been building for 2 months and had run out of room to stay contained. "Because I have the forge, and I have my hands, and precious little else worth offering anybody, and I wasn't about to stand here and watch you lose the shop you built with your own 2 hands, over $200, when I could do something about it." "That wasn't your choice to make," she said, though her voice had lost most of its edge by the time she said it. "I know that," he said. "I knew it while I was doing it. Didn't stop me." She looked at his hands, then really looked past the bandages, at the fresh burns beneath them, at the ink stains from the bank counter he'd never quite managed to scrub off. She thought of Nate, who had told her privately at the dance with entirely good intentions that he meant to propose before the season's end and pay off her note outright as a wedding gift, a solution offered in full daylight with flowers and an audience and every social approval Cedar Hollow could offer. And she thought of this 4 unsigned Thursdays, a man working himself toward his own brother's fate in the dark, so that no one least of all her would have to know he'd done it. "You could have told me," she said, quieter now. "Telling you would have meant asking something back," he said. "I wasn't in a position to ask you for anything. Still don't know that I am." She did not answer that directly. She looked at his hands a moment longer, and then at his face, and found she did not have a single word ready that would do justice to what she was feeling. So she said nothing at all and simply stood there with him in the forge light, while the fire settled and cracked between them. Some things she had learned from him, without either of them meaning to teach it, were worth waiting to understand fully before you tried to say them out loud. She left without resolving anything between them, because there was nothing yet to resolve. Only a truth now sitting plainly between two people who both knew it and neither of them that evening quite ready to act on it. But she carried the 4 unsigned entries home with her, like something she intended to keep, and that night, for the first time since Missouri, she found she was not afraid of what a ledger might say about her worth to anyone. The fire started small, the way fires that end badly almost always do. A lamp set too close to a bolt of unbleached cotton on the cutting table left burning, while Amelia worked past midnight to finish the rancher's wife's order before the promised delivery date. She had not meant to stay so late. She had meant an hour earlier to bank the lamp and go home and sleep on everything that had passed between herself and Micah that week, the 4 unsigned entries, and the things neither of them had said yet. But the last shirt needed only its buttons, and the last dress only its hem, and she had told herself 20 minutes, then 20 more, until the lamp's flame found the loose thread of cotton batting. She hadn't swept up from the floor, and by the time she smelled the smoke, it had already climbed the table leg. She fought it herself for the first frantic minute, beating at it with a bolt of wool that only fed the flame faster, and understood with the particular clarity that arrives exactly too late that the shop's iron security bars installed the previous spring after a break-in at the milliner's next-door bars she had paid for and been grateful for, and never once considered a danger, now held the front window shut from the inside as securely as they held any burglar out. She reached the door. The door had not been barred, but the smoke by then was thick enough to turn the room to black. And in the panic of it, she went the wrong direction toward the window instead, and found herself trapped in the corner of her own shop, with flame climbing the bolts of fabric she'd spent 2 months' income to buy. Micah smelled the smoke before he saw it, working the rail yard's overnight contract in the forge yard 2 doors down, and was in the street before the first bell rang from the church tower. He reached the shop ahead of anyone else in Cedar Hollow, ahead of the volunteer bucket line still assembling 3 streets over ahead of even Nate Colby, who came at a dead run from the boarding house with half his shirt still unbuttoned. The front window was black with smoke and barred shut from the inside, and Micah did not waste breath calling her name through it. He ran the length of the block back to his own forge, took the hot chisel still warm from the night's work, and the heaviest sledge he owned, and ran back with both and set to the iron bars, the way he set to every piece of metal that had ever come across his anvil, without panic, without wasted motion, working the joint at the exact angle that would give fastest. It took him 4 strikes. It felt to the small crowd gathering behind him by then considerably longer. The bar gave. He tore the window frame the rest of the way with his bare hands, glass and splinters be damned, and reached into the smoke and found her wrist and pulled her through an opening barely wide enough for her shoulders into the cold November air. She came out, coughing, her eyes streaming, her hands scorched where she'd tried to fight the fire herself, and he did not let go of her, not when the bucket line finally arrived and began working the flames, not when Nate reached them and asked breathless whether she was hurt, not for the better part of a full minute that felt to both of them considerably longer than that. "You went in for me," she said, when she'd found enough breath to speak. "Had to," he said. which was not exactly true. Plenty of men in Cedar Hollow would have waited for the bucket line, would have called it sensible caution rather than cowardice. But it was true enough for him in that moment that he did not correct it. She looked at his hands freshly burned again, on top of weeks of burns already healing, and understood that some men solved a woman's problem loudly, with flowers and proposals, and an audience to witness their generosity, and some men solved it in the dark, at their own cost, and told no one. And that the second kind of man, having just torn a barred window open with his hands to reach her, was standing in front of her now, with no careful, even voice left to hide behind. "Micah," she said. "I know," he said before she could finish using the word she'd learned from him weeks ago, the word that meant more than its 2 letters usually carried. "I know." The bucket line brought the fire under control. Within the half-hour, the front room of Reeves' Dressworks scorched, but the building itself saved the bulk of the damage confined to fabric and furniture that could be replaced. Neither fact seemed to matter much to the crowd still gathered in the cold street, watching a blacksmith and a dressmaker stand together in the wreckage of her shop, neither one able to explain when Odessa Vance finally asked outright exactly why it had taken quite that long to let go of each other's hands. Nate came to the forge the following morning, before Micah had so much as banked the fire back up, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, the way a man stands when he has already decided something and simply needs to say it out loud to make it settled. "I heard enough last night," he said, "and saw enough of it myself to know where things stand." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'd meant to ask Miss Reeves properly before the season was out. Pay off her note as a wedding, start the marriage clean." He set the hat down on the workbench and studied it a moment. Man who pays a woman's debt in silence for 2 months and then tears a barred window open with his own hands to get to her, he's already answered a question. I was still working up the nerve to ask. No sense in me pretending otherwise. Micah said nothing right away, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like either false modesty or a claim he wasn't yet certain he'd earned. "She's a good woman," he said finally. "She is," Nate agreed. "I think she could have been happy here with the right man." He picked his hat back up. "I just wasn't the man she was looking at. Took me longer to see it than it should have." He extended his hand, and Micah shook it, and there was no bitterness in the grip on either side. Only the plain, unglamorous decency of 2 men agreeing on a fact neither of them had chosen, but both of them could live with. "One thing," Nate said at the door. "She's been patient about this a good deal longer than most women would bother being. Don't make her wait through another winter figuring out what you already know." He walked out into this cold morning, and Micah stood at the anvil a long while after turning that over the way he turned over everything, and found for the first time in 2 years that he did not want to turn it over any further. He wanted simply to say it. I went to Odessa's boarding house that afternoon, where Amelia had taken a room while the shop's front was repaired, and knocked on a door he'd never had reason to knock on before the bank's payment book carried under one bandaged arm. She opened the door, looked at his hands, then at his face, and stepped back to let him in. He stood in the middle of her small room, hat in hand, the way Nate's had been that morning, and found the words came easier than he'd expected now that he'd finally decided to let them. "I've been telling myself for 2 years that I don't have much to offer anybody," he said. "The forge the debt on it hands that don't come clean no matter how I scrub them. Told myself you deserved better than a blacksmith with his brother's note still hanging over him. Told myself that enough times I nearly believed it was a kindness keeping my distance instead of asking for anything." "It wasn't a kindness," she said, not unkindly. "It was a decision you made for both of us, and you never once asked me what I wanted." "I know that now," he said. "I fixed your latch for free the first week, and I told myself it was nothing. Paid your note down 4 Thursdays running, and told myself it wasn't worth mentioning. I've spent 2 years making myself smaller than the work I do. And I didn't understand until last night, pulling you out that window, that it was never going to be enough to keep doing it and saying nothing. I know, Amelia said. And this time it was her using the word he'd taught her, the one that meant she had understood this about him long before he'd managed to say it himself. I've known since the ledger, Micah. I wasn't confused about who was paying that note. I was only waiting for you to stop pretending you hadn't. He looked at her for a long moment, the payment book still under his arm, the whole small room quiet around them. It was never the money, she said. I've had a man offer to solve my problems out loud with flowers and an audience, and it moved me exactly as much as flowers usually do. What I wanted was a man who'd do it in silence at his own cost, because it needed doing, and let me find out about it in my own time instead of expecting credit for it. You found out anyway, he said. I always do, she said, and something in her voice, warm and certain, told him this was not a complaint. He set the payment book down on her table marked Paid in Full in his own careful hand, and she picked it up and looked at it a long moment before setting it back down exactly where he'd placed it. By spring, the shop was rebuilt, the scorch marks sanded from the front counter, and Reeves Dress Works reopened its doors with a payment book kept behind the register as the first object anyone would see coming in, not hidden, not explained, simply there, the way the truest things in Cedar Hollow tended to be once nobody felt the need to keep them quiet anymore. Some mornings Micah brought coffee across the street before the forge needed tending and sat on the second stool without being asked, and Amelia kept sewing while he drank it, her measuring tape and his tongs, sharing the same worn workbench, and neither of them found much need to say out loud what the whole town had long since worked out for itself.
Micah Sutton went into a burning building for a woman he spent 2 months insisting he had nothing to offer. He didn't think it over. He saw the actual problem, not the fire everyone else was fighting from the outside, but the barred window keeping her in, and went to the root of it with a chisel and a sledge until it gave. That's not a range gesture. That's just he would always be a man who paid debts in silence, who fixed things and said nothing about it, who mattered a great deal more to Cedar Hollow than the town ever bothered to notice out loud. I think about Amelia sometimes about what it takes to work into a town that's already decided who you marry, and choose instead to keep noticing the man nobody else talked to look at twice. That kind of patience is its own quiet kind of courage. Where are you watching from tonight? Rub your city and stay in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travel. If this one found you, consider staying a while longer. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, keep writing.